Who was John James Willekes Jr., Mr. JJ Cool?
John James Willekes Jr., JJ Cool, was probably one of the coolest persons you would meet in your lifetime. Mine for sure. Not only was he a music educator, he was a devout musician. That's very important. And had the magnitude to draw people to his incredible sound. And for that, we give him honor.
Okay, and what else can you tell us about John James Willekes Jr.?
Well, for me, he was like this ball of energy, just waiting to explode in terms of his musical career. And what I noticed about John James so very early on in the 80s when we met in New York, was this guy had an enormous appreciation for great music, in particular in jazz. And before long, he was evolving with some of the jazz greats on the scene, so that when we had a chance to relocate, form family, unite, come to Curacao, he came with that kinetic energy. And for here in the late 80s, he became one of the principal players to ignite the jazz fire in the late 1980s. Yeah, and the rest is history.
I, I am sure, I'm very sure that he might have worked with a lot of local musicians as well as musicians in America and all over the world.
Yes, he did. He did. And he had that over the world experience for the most part in New York City and also in Atlanta, Georgia. I can also tell you, Mr. Johnny, that the Jazz Hall of Fame is located in my hometown, which is in Birmingham, Alabama. And by then, when we went to Atlanta, we actually had a chance to audition and become a headliner at the Alabama Jazz Hall of Fame, which was a big honor. And there he met a lot of great artists as well, also while living in Atlanta, Georgia.
Can you tell us something about Jack uh, Mick Foundation?
Most certainly, I'd be delighted to. Again, after relocating to Curacao, Willemstad, the idea was to bring your talents, your wisdom, and your knowledge with you, both of us. So what John James Jr. and I did was pretty much combine our creative talents, God-given, to create something, not so much for him and for me, but for the public in general of Curacao. In particular, our target group were the children. And inside of the Dojak Foundation, we developed something and created something called the 3LC, which means look, listen, and learn. That particular program that John James beautifully executed was to go directly into the barrios, into the communities, and to give free interactive jazz concerts with the children via the birth centers or community centers. And before we knew it, we had literally gone to about 9 with the waiting list before his untimely death. In fact, John, our last engagement with the children's activities, 3LC, Look, Listen, and Learn, was at the Children's Museum. Yes. And so
Can Can you tell us also something about the stamp, the stamp that he received, and we started with the John James stamp?
I would be delighted to, sir. And what it is, this was actually a personal gift for John James Willekes Jr. But at some point along the line, it dawned on me, well, wait a minute, hold it. John James did not make this music by himself. There are other so-called legends who also should have a stamp and be recognized. Just a small way of doing recognition to people who made valuable contributions in the idiom of jazz right here in Curacao. So that said, it took a couple of years from my going back and forth to the my friends at the post office until we got it right. So after all the facts were in, I say, well, look, we're going to start with him, and the idea is with those of us who myself and others deem as bona fide Curacao legends should and ought to get a stamp. And yes, and we were very happy to donate one to the National Archives of Biblioteka Nashonal. What was that? In 2019, I do believe.